I'm Rosemary McDaniel, and I was born in Elkhart, Indiana in 1942. My father called me Pansy. I don't know why, but he did. Basically, I went by Romy just because it's short and easy to use. My father's parents' names were Solomon Sherwin and Laura Sanger Sherwin. That's on my father's side. On my mother's side, it was Roy Camp and Tina Camp. And she'd been married 3 times. In 1832, the Sangers came from the east. Rebecca Barrett Bacon Sanger and her sons, who were both with her. They brought also the husband who died shortly after he came here, and that was Noadiah Jr., Noadiah Sanger Jr. They came in 1832 from the East Coast. Why they chose Bristol, I'm not really sure, but I think they were looking for land, which they bought land here and were farmers, and they were not much when it comes to having cows or that kind of thing. They just grew crops and that kind of thing. Well, my grandparents on my father's side were already dead when I was here, so I didn't ever hear from them. I just heard the things from my father, who was, as I said, 56 when I was born. So I just learned about the family from him, and of course I had all the pictures and all the letters and things that he had. On my mother's side, my grandfather died when I was 5. My grandmother died when I was 13, but I was not really very close to my mother's parents. They were more distant to me. My Sanger and Sherwin grandparents were buried at both Bonneville and Oak Ridge in Bristol. My mother's family were all buried in South Bend cemeteries because they lived there. I went to school at Beardsley School in Elkhart, and from there I went to Northside, it's junior high, and then from there, of course, I went to Elkhart High School. I think I liked history and English best, and I was a very good reader, and I could read, and usually the history teachers really liked me to read, so they had me read to the class because I was a good reader. My father was born in Bristol, and my mother was born in South Bend. My mother I had put in, we have the cremation section in the Oak Ridge Cemetery, and my husband, me, my son, my mother will all be buried in the same place there. My father was buried in Bonneville. I could have buried my mother in Bonneville. It was just easier to put her in Oak Ridge. I was not one who was friends with kids in high school. I had a couple of friends, but I was just not one that did that. We would go, there were a couple of places downtown that we'd either go to lunch or we'd go to something before school. But usually I just had a couple friends that I would go with. I wasn't one that hung out with a lot of people in my class. In fact, when I went to the 50th anniversary that we had a few years ago, I was amazed that I didn't know most of them. They weren't friendly to me then, and they weren't friendly to me now. I brought my friend, was my best friend from kindergarten through high school, who now lives in Arizona, and she comes every couple of years to visit me. She came back, and we went to the 50th anniversary together, And nobody talked to either one of us. But then that was okay. My husband, Carl, I met when I was 14 and he was 13. And he lived across the street from my best friend then. And so we all would hang out there. And he was half Hispanic. And I was intrigued by that because, you know, I never knew anybody who was Hispanic. He had dark brown eyes and black hair, and he was handsome, and I liked that. It probably wasn't the best choice that I made, but that's the way it is. His name was Carl Allen McDaniel. He died in 2013, and he is buried in the crematory at Oak Ridge, as there is room there for me. And my son is buried there, and so is my mother. I had only one son. His name was Devin McDaniel, and he was very much an individual, and he did what he did, and like it or not, he ended up owning a bakery, and that was in Dowagiac, Michigan. He had a farm in Michigan, and when he died, I had to sell all that. That was not easy. He was 55. So, yeah. And it was in 2015. My first job was at an insurance company where I only worked for a month because I had put my application into Miles, but I was waiting, and I went to work at the insurance company. I hated it because I have bad handwriting, and she hated that. And you had to close out your drawer every night and make sure that every penny was in place. And I hated that too. And at noon, we would go out to Dave's Drive-In down on Cassopolis Street. I'd have to go with the other ladies in the office, and I hated that. But they would always get French fries, and they would always make sure that we had dipped butter. We'd dip our French fries in butter, which I thought was very odd. So then I had my application into Miles for about a month or month and a half, and then I went in to take the shorthand and the typing tests, and I noticed that all that room was filled with a lot of others that I had graduated with. And I went to work at Miles in 1961, and I worked there until I worked there for 50 years, whatever that is. And I was one of the ones that lasted. I mean, what you have to do when you work in a big company like that, which changes the people who are in charge or whatever, you need to reinvent yourself. I mean, I had to reinvent myself every time, and that worked because I outlasted most people. It was kind of a place where your boss changed quite frequently. So what I would do is I would make sure to be friends with either the president, secretary of the company, and by doing that, the president would always, if he wanted to know something or he wanted something done that he didn't want to exactly account for, I would do that. That's how I got by. What's the strangest question that anyone ever asked me? Well, I remember strange questions. I was doing things at the museum when they had like dinners and they had dances and that kind of thing. And this one lady said to me, "Why do you like us so much, you know?" And I said, "Well, because my people are from Bristol and I'm interested in Bristol. That's why I do it," which I thought was a strange question. I'm really passionate about history. I'm really passionate about genealogy, and I'm passionate about learning and understanding the history and sharing it. I mean, I share my pictures, I share my interest, and I just think it's something that more people should do. I was very protected as a child. My parents, you know, were always there, and I had a friend, and really I was very much protected and stayed at home and didn't really go out in the world. And in school, like I said, I had a friend or two, but I wasn't one to be one of the popular kids, ever. And I didn't care. I knew that my father's people came from Bristol. In fact, when I was young, we would go to Bonneville Cemetery, we would go to the other cemeteries, and he had, as you can see on my shelf, all these things, pictures, and fortunately, most of the pictures were identified. They had who the people were. And so I was fascinated by what he had, and he was also one that would keep track of when somebody was born, when somebody died, when somebody married. He had all the dates for everybody. And that was wonderful, because otherwise, how would I have known that? Because by the time I was born, most of those people were gone. When I was born, my father was 56 years old. My mother was 30. So by the time I was born, all my father's relatives were gone. And my mother's relatives, I knew, but I was never fond of the people on my mother's side. They just weren't. In fact, I'm naughty because I would always call my mother's sister my damn aunt. And I remember when my mother would go operations and she would have to go to Indianapolis or whatever, then I would have to stay with someone. And when I stayed with her sister here, the kids made me drink beer. Well, that was it. I never wanted to stay there ever again. So she would have me stay with her sister in South Bend, who were decent people, and I liked them much better. The Bristol, Indiana Heritage Society was Jack Watson and Penny Bucks and Linda Powell and I decided to start this thing we called the Indiana Heritage Society, because we, for a few times, had people come here to the funeral home. We have a lot of room downstairs. We put chairs out, and we had people come to tell us history. And it was really well done. And the last one we had last month was at the library, because we were redoing the floor and everything in the funeral home, but we will have it back here. And it's some place for people to come and talk about the history of Bristol, and for us to have a website and information to have people go and look at the history of Bristol. And thanks to Larry App, we are getting that, actually some film now for that. So it's kind of cool.